Yeah, welcome to another paper presentation on narrative visualization. This time it's quite a recent paper that I want to discuss, entitled Three Trajectories for Narrative Visualization. This paper appeared in a journal that I came across not so often so far, to be honest, Visual Informatics, a quite recent journal also, but it is not the first paper on narrative visualization that was published in this journal, so that's also an interesting journal for this kind of research. Cameron Edmond and Tomasz Bednarz are the authors. The outline of this presentation, according to the paper, is first a short discussion on narrative techniques, then a definition of narrative visualization that also helps to distinguish between data visualization and narrative visualization. And it is indeed useful to be clear about what are the differences between the two. I often saw discussions about reviewers whether a certain paper is really narrative visualization or whether it is in fact more traditional information visualization, just renamed to narrative visualization, which of course would not be so useful. And then the core of this paper is on three narrative visualization trajectories. A trajectory here is a little bit related to a scenario. A trajectory has a temporal component. And this is used also to classify previous work. So a little bit more than in other paper presentations, I will use this paper also to go into some of the work that the authors here consider and classify based on these three narratives. Yeah, the four narrative techniques that the authors mentioned, using examples from Shakespeare, yeah, so that's quite interesting and tradition, start with focalization, one or a few perspectives from which a story is told. Yeah, you know that I always think about medical examples. You can tell a story from a physician's perspective, yeah, how it is to treat a particular disease, from the perspective of a nurse, yeah, who is quite essential, not in surgery, but in many other aspects of patient well-being, some specialized nurses even in surgery, but most of them not. Another perspective would be from a hospital manager, yeah, who would look for the amount of money that can be gained with a certain kind of treatment. The patient has a completely different perspective, and parents or other close relatives as well. Yeah. So therefore, to think about focalization is really something quite useful when you start to think about narrative visualization. Allegory means the signification of a narrative, and that is related to metaphors and symbolism. Yeah, I found this first a bit vague, but when I thought a bit more about metaphors, at least that is something that's also really useful for narrative visualization. So, for example, one could think about metaphors for preventing diseases. Yeah, if I think of our own work, there are some metaphors that we use, like the liver shelf. That's part of a training system where different livers are arranged in shelves, and the students can take them out, can grab them and explore them in detail. So we use the shelf that is familiar to people from a library as a metaphor. Or another metaphor that we have used several times in desktop setting and immersive setting is the 3D puzzle. Yeah, that means students should learn about a relevant part of the anatomy by composing objects themselves. Or another metaphor in surgery is the virtual scalpel. The student that trains operates an instrument that looks and behaves similar to a scalpel. When you think about metaphors, it's always important that you choose metaphors that are really familiar to the target users. So you must make sure this by interviews, for example. and you must choose metaphors where the associations that the users have with these metaphors are useful in the sense that you really want to realize these aspects of a metaphor. Yeah. Otherwise, a metaphor, even if it is familiar, may be misleading. People may overestimate what is possible with a particular system. So allegory leads to a discussion about metaphors, and that's indeed useful for narrative visualization. The two further narrative techniques that the authors here mentioned are character and characterization. So characters are often humans, but not necessarily. Yeah. There are many examples of stories that you read. The characters could be soldiers, for example, and in medicine, of course, patients or nurses or infected patients. Yeah, but also inanimate objects may be characters, for example, countries, hospitals, or other facilities. And they can be characterized by showing something or telling something. Personification means that human-like qualities are also assigned to non-human entities. We have seen in other data videos examples where data is visualized with isotype visualizations. That would be one variant of personification. Yeah, two more key terms and a definition of narrative visualization. Fabula, these are the raw data of a story, and sujet, I hope I pronounced this correctly, provide the structure of the story. Yeah, that is not an invention of the authors of this paper. They relate here to a much older paper. So, and based on this very short characterization of fabula and sujet, the authors here come up with a definition of narrative as a method by which a story, fabula, is told, sujet, where the causal links between events are exposed via characters, focalization, and various forms of symbolism. So you recognize now why I explained these techniques before. They are now used here for a definition. That's not the first and definitely not the only possible visualization of narrative visualization. It corresponds to some earlier definitions from Booth, for example, that he also emphasizes that narrative events are causally linked, not just a sequence of things that happen one after the other, but there must be a causal link between them, and they are temporarily traversed through the act of narration. Other definitions have another focus. Maybe it's too hard to say it's in contrast to them, but they emphasize other aspects. So, for example, Bruce Bongshin Lee in her paper emphasizes the use of annotations, and that was also a reason for me to think about annotation in narrative visualization, and some of the earlier videos, for example, from the chart accent system, really emphasize annotations. And Brian used in his definition static charts embellished with text-based narrative cues, such as single sentence statements. Yeah, so that's different, and these are also valid definitions, of course. Yeah, but maybe what could be agreed on by most researchers on narrative visualization is that narrative visualization is at the intersection of narration, yeah, borrowing from Shakespeare, theater, drama, literature, yeah, narration, and data visualization. And in data visualization, we have some well-known and established principles. For example, we employ color in a very goal-directed manner and in a consistent manner. We may use overlays in order to show how different layers of data interact with each other. We can use juxtaposing or animated transitions so that changes between different visualizations can be seen continuously, can be observed continuously. That would fit very well to this idea of showing a narration a sequence of temporal events. Yeah. So what is the similarity between data visualization and narrative visualizations? Both translate raw data into meaningful representations. And in both cases, the goal is, of course, to enable understanding and enable getting insights. Yeah, insights are so important that one frequently used method of evaluation is insight-based evaluation. Yeah, are users really able to gain some insights from the visualization? So this is the similarity. The difference is that only narrative visualization employs a narrative to achieve this goal of facilitating understanding. Yeah, in a more open exploratory setting, there is no narrative. Yeah, let me come to the core part of the paper that I want to present, namely the three trajectories, yeah, that help to discriminate different ways how narration can be used. They differ, one may say, in how close they are to a traditional narration, yeah, without any computer support from literature, for example, or on the other end of the spectrum, how close they are to data visualization, exploratory data visualization with experts as the target audience. Yeah, three different trajectories. One is the so-called leading narrative, and that's the one that is closer to traditional narrative structures. Yeah, only some degree of data and of visualization is injected. Yeah, I've really used the citations here because I think the wording that the authors used is actually quite interesting. An integrated narrative means that there are own narrative techniques based on data and visualization. And then there is supporting narrative, which means that the core is really the presentation of data, and only to a little extent narrative is incorporated. Yeah. So, for example, you could imagine, and I have seen examples like this, that you see causes of death over time in different regions. There are some outliers or extremum values labeled or emphasized in another way. So there is some kind of textual and graphical annotation, but it is not too far away from a kind of presentation of the data that would be meant for experts. Yeah, it's called supporting narrative because the narrative only plays supportive roles. Maybe a very popular example that I would characterize as supporting narrative is the Corona dashboard from Johns Hopkins University that presents Corona numbers, vaccination status, and case fatality ratio, a number of different data over time and for the different countries of the world and the different counties of the United States. Yeah, that could be seen as supporting narrative. It's definitely not meant or restricted to be used by experts. It has a broad audience, but it is closer to data exploration. Yeah, in medical visualization, I think primarily integrated narrative is useful. The examples that we think about in our group, I would classify with this categorization as integrated narrative. Leading narrative occurs often in online journals, and yeah, I would say in our work we integrate more narration than just supportive narrative. Yeah, that's often not so helpful. If we come up with data, for example, about the rupture risk of aneurysm, and basically we present all the data, how the morphology of aneurysms or the hemodynamic characteristics may influence the rupture risk only with some kind of annotation, I would assume that this would not be particularly interesting and not engage users in the way as it would be desirable. Yeah, we need more narration like in integrated narrative. So this diagram, yeah, puts these three categories on an axis between the traditional narrative and the data visualization, where it becomes obvious that the leading narrative is much closer to the traditional narrative. The supportive narrative is, on the other hand, much closer to data visualization, and the integrated narrative is somewhere in the middle. Yeah. So one example, I think, for the supportive narrative is the WHO data on death on the road. That means on people that get killed on roads, either as car drivers, pedestrians, or so on. So I briefly want to show this example. Let me see where it is. It is here. What do we see here? We see a map that's color-coded according to whether the situation in a state is good or bad with respect to the corresponding part of the data. Yeah. So green, of course, means something is very good, and red means it is bad. Yeah. You see here not only the data about the number of people that were killed per million, but you see also information on laws. Yeah. So for example, laws that relates to seat belts, or whether alcohol drinking is allowed to some extent or not. Also with respect to limits, driving limits. What is the driving limit on the motor road? What is the driving limit in rural areas, for example? Yeah, so with respect to speed, for example, and if you look here at motorway, then you see that most countries have a speed limit. Also on motorways, only a few, Germany is among them, has none. And if you hover over a particular country, then you see all the speed limits, or whether seat belts are mandatory for front seats and rear seats and so on. And that is always contrasted with the data on the death on the road. So that's a kind of supportive navigation. Basically, you explore the data, but you get supported by appropriate textual information that help you to make sense of the data. So let me go back to the presentation. Here are some examples and features for these three different kinds of narrative trajectories. Leading narrative, do you remember, closer to the traditional narrative, that's the essential features. Visualization may support the narrative, but text is typically the focus of this, so there is more text than images. And traditional narratives are clearly present. Follows a certain structure, how the tension is rising and later falling. Subjects need to be very clear. Focalization is quite important. So here are some examples from traditional media, as you see. I think this is this appears in the New York Times, and that's the Washington Post, obviously. A few more examples for the leading narrative. Here are a couple of tools mentioned. LitVis, for example, that's literature visualization based on Wikidata that is available at GitHub. So I added here the link for this. If you just would search for LitVis and you would find it as well. CVis is a tool, this one here, where narratives are created for emergency situations like an earthquake or a severe flooding. A lot of data arrives in a centralized way and is automatically analyzed in a way that narrative visualizations can be generated so that the relevant stakeholders get a shared understanding of the urgency of certain measures. Yeah, so that's quite important. Yeah, I would not say too much to gravity. Few comments to NBVT, that is the system that we see here. Building and visualizing narratives in digital libraries is the abbreviation. Here is the link, dlnarratives.eu. There is an ontology for narratives, a narrative building tools, and then some examples that were created with this tool. Yeah, that is what you would find here. Yeah, again, that's leading narrative closer to the traditional narrative. Let's come to integrated narrative. Traditional structures are still present but not dominating so much. Visualization plays a larger role, and conceptually narrative techniques like focalization, characterization, metaphors are used. Yeah, and often there are not real persons involved, but inanimate objects. They become then the focus of the story. Yeah, here are a few examples. Yeah, I don't have much more information for them. Again, you see that they appear in traditional media. Gapminder, that is Hans Rosling's tools, where he provided very interesting interactive exploration, but also animations related to many facts related to the development of countries in the world with respect to poverty, health status, and so on. One of the techniques in this category is how many households are like yours. I think that's a quite popular narrative visualization, appeared in the New York Times. So I currently live together with my son, who is 23 years old. So I selected first that I live alone, and then added a child over 18 years. And that tells me that 0.5% of all households have this characteristics, yeah, that there is a single male together with a son who is over 18 years. Actually, my second son, who's also over 18, also often lives with us. So I could add him as well. And then it would turn out that my household is even more special. It would be only 0.05% of all households would be like this. Yeah. So personalization is done here. And then some more data is created related to this. Those households were most likely to occur in 2009. Yeah, that means over time they have information available, and the type of household where I live in was 10 years before more typical than it is today. And compared to other groups, a higher proportion of people other than Hispanics, Blacks, White Asians live in these households. Yeah, so a categorization of households with respect to ethnicity. And here is some information on the typical income situation for households like mine. Yeah, so that is, I think, a quite good example for an integrated narrative, and in fact, it's also a quite popular one. Yeah, other examples for integrated narrative: the timeline storyteller from Bremer et al. Debate with, I will show two images of this, Flourish and Datatoon. I have not looked up them in so much detail. Here are the characteristics of integrated narratives. So that is what you should ask about an integrated narrative visualization. Yeah, I always think about medical examples. A timeline storyteller could be interesting for patient stories, because if you want to characterize a patient, then a timeline also plays an important role. That is not my observation. That was already done by Pleasant and Schneiderman in the 1990s. They presented lifelines where they came up with a good overview type of visualization of a patient history, including diagnostic events, treatment events, hospital stays, and symptom development, onset of symptom, the finishing of symptoms, when they were given a drug or not. So that could be perhaps translated more to narrative visualization with a tool like this timeline storyteller. I looked a bit in one example, that's debate with, because I also think that's an important example also from an ethical point of view. They tried to make political debates available for non-experts, so not a tool for academics, a political debate between candidates for presidency. And you see a couple of visualizations like this interaction graphs here. That means when there was an interaction between two candidates, and this interaction could be in the sense that one candidate agrees with another one, or one candidate attacks another one, or one candidate defends after an attack to another one. So here's an annotated script. Buttigieg said something and Bernie Sanders said something, and this symbol here means that they attacked each other. That is for people who do not want to follow the whole 3-hour debate, but want to have an interesting and engaging summary. They used actually a couple of visualizations. Here are just a few examples. So for example, here you would see how often one of the candidates mentions a particular topic like education or foreign policy or healthcare. That does not tell you what is the specific standpoint of this candidate with respect to this topic, but you get an understanding of whether a candidate ignores gun control, for example, or whether this is an example of a topic that this candidate talked about. So that's debate with. What can be learned from this? I think it is an interesting paper, starting with the initial narrative techniques that were considered, leading to the definition of narrative visualization and the contrast between data visualization and narrative visualization. I think these 3 narrative trajectories indeed may be inspiring. And also, by the way, I want to recommend this paper for the references. So it really considers a large amount of previous work in a very systematic manner that is also quite useful. Here is the look at the references that I used for this presentation. Much smaller list, of course, than the reference list of the paper that I have presented. That's this one here. So I mentioned definitions from Bongshin Lee, from Brian and colleagues, and from Booth. And I mentioned that these authors referred in the narrative technologies, techniques that they described in the beginning of the paper, on this older paper, Narratology, which is a book chapter in a book edited by Selden. And among the many references for specific tools, I looked a little bit more in detail in this debate with tool, visualizing political debates for non-expert users, that was presented at the WIS conference in 2020. With this, I'm at the end of this presentation and want to thank you for your attention.